everybody, this is Anne. Welcome back to, well, I guess the Painting Big channel with the Foundations of Miniature Painting series, which I thought was done, and then I realized that I haven't covered things like prep work or priming or pinning, the 3 Ps. So today we are going to start with prep work, how to remove mold lines, flash, what to look for on various materials of models, and techniques you can use to remove those imperfections so that you can have the best possible model for your paint job. All right, let's get to it. Alrighty. Well, we're going to start with PVC plastic, which is pretty much anything that you're getting these days out of board games. Most of that's going to be some sort of variant on PVC. Dungeons and Doggies, this baby Kraken, was from their last Kickstarter. Also, Reaper Bones models. So this is a Bones Black figure, which is a little bit more hard and less rubbery than the standard Bones, which you'll find in a lot of the big monsters that Reaper does. But it's all PVC, so it's a particular type of plastic. It tends to be a little bendy. You can see that the Bones Black doesn't bend as much as some of the original Bones material. This one also has a fairly high durometer, so it is still a little bit bendy. The detail's usually pretty good. The thing to watch out for on these guys, though, is mold lines. So when you put one of these guys on a mold and shoot it full of the plastic, you usually have a line that runs around the figure, and a clever mold maker will hide that by making that line go along the edges of armor plates. Like you can see that this one has been kind of guided to go along the edge here. That way it's not going straight over nice pieces of detail like this. And it's going up around the skull here. You can see that little line going up around here. But it's really not a big deal. So this model has been put together. Reaper's pretty good at this. You can see the mold line here on the edge of the blade. The sword blades here. These are easy. And then on Baby Kraken here, we can see that the mold line unfortunately does go over this tentacle, leaving quite a big divot in it. And it also goes over the brim of the hat here. You can see that that's got a line right there going up there. And these things are ugly. Honestly, if you don't care, if you just want to paint the figure and you don't care about perfection and you don't care about like having a line here and there, you just want to paint, just do it. There's nothing that says you have to clean your figures before you start painting. That said, if you have a perfectionistic gene like I do, I'm always fighting it. Or if you just like to have a clean model without a lot of blemishes on it, and that makes you feel better about painting it, a lot of people are like that, then maybe think about doing some corrections. So your tools for correcting a lot of this stuff are going to be things like hobby knives, diamond files. I don't use regular files, I only use diamond files, because they will essentially, it's a lot easier to take off material with them. You use things like side cutters. And you also can use putties, and we'll talk about why you might want to use putty for some of these corrections as we go. So for plastic like the Bones, I honestly find that a file is not ideal. The reason is that since the material is softer, it tends to pill up the material a little bit. So you can see how it'll take that line away, but you see it leaves that really rough surface behind it. Now, this rough surface, honestly, once you go over it with paint, isn't going to be that evident, but it's still not as smooth as if you just took a hobby knife and gently scraped away the plastic. So I usually use a knife on PVC models. My knife blade is not very sharp. You can see that I'm kind of cushioning my thumb on it. It doesn't need to be very sharp to take this down, because remember, this is a softer plastic. So I'm just going to slice. Scrape. It's really not really divoting the model, it's just scraping. And that will leave a nice smooth surface. I can correct some of these rougher edges from when I use the file. So yeah, depending on how hard your plastic is going to determine how well a file might work on it. On this guy, this is a little harder, right? You've got like a line on the face here, we've got a line on the tentacle. So what I might do is just kind of try to scrape away at the top of that tentacle a little bit. When you find things that are at a really bad angle, that's when you might consider using putty. But sometimes if you just switch around the model in your hand, you might be able to work at it a little bit better. This plastic feels a little more brittle, so I'm going to try my file. And this is a very small diamond file. I like these mini files, though, because they will let me get into areas that others won't. So I'm getting a little bit of that texture I can see it, but it's actually not as rough as it was on the Bones Black figure. And that's because this plastic's a little more brittle, it's harder, so it's working a little bit better with the file. And I might need to work on this. You can see that that line is still there, so sometimes you need to like scrape away at it for a while to get that taken care of. The line goes up the side of the face here too, and up the hat, so some of these areas might be easier to catch with a file, and some of them might be easier to catch very gently with a knife. With the stronger the plastic, the more you can press with your knife without worrying about leaving a divot. So you're going kind of like that, and so on. Now, when you've got a very line that's really in a convex area or in a heavily detailed area, that's when I sometimes will use putty. You can see this, the water that's splooshing over the edge of the bucket that he's in, but you've got this unsightly mold line that's really coming along and interrupting this nice little detail. So at some point I will do a video on how to like take green stuff and kind of just use it to fill in that mold line, keeping the sculpt overall without having to gouge away. Because if you gouge away at something that, like this, you're just going to ruin it, right? And that's just going to happen sometimes. One of the worst mold line offenders is mold lines through hair. He doesn't have any. He does, but it's kind of like all over the place. So it's really hard to remove mold lines from hair, but the easiest way I have found is honestly to scrape away against the direction of the mold line to like flatten the hair down, and then to use my knife to kind of go into those strands and divot like this. So first flatten it down to the same level as the rest of the hair, then use your knife to press in and bring those strands back a little bit. Usually only need a little bit there, and then you can use paint to disguise the rest. All right? So another thing, one last thing about PVC models is like primers do react to some of them. So be careful with the primer you use. Maybe test it on a figure or on the base of the model, because sometimes it'll just leave it kind of, the primer won't cure, it'll be sticky, and then it's having a reaction with the PVC. So sometimes you'll be able to go on Reddit or various like Reaper forums and find out the primers that might work for you. Or if you're me, you might decide not to prime at all and just wash the model. I do work on Bones models without priming regularly. Here's an example of a mouseling that we're working on right now. But you can see the gray plastic there on the hilt of the sword. We've covered over almost everything else at this point. But I find that Reaper paint adheres well enough to the Bones USA and Bones Black and regular Bones that I honestly don't prime. I just wash the models in hot water with a couple drops of dish soap in there, swirl them around, and then I will rinse them thoroughly and let them dry on a paper towel overnight. The next day I'll just start to paint them. If you have a model like that you don't want to prime and you do intend to game with it, i.e. it's going to be getting a lot of wear and tear, consider putting a heavy coat of sealer on if you don't prime. All right, so let's move on to metal figures. These used to be the thing you found when you looked for miniatures, and nowadays they're getting rarer and rarer as many people are going to plastic. This is Dark Sword, female paladin of the Raven. The things you're going to run into on metal miniatures are pieces that need to be removed from a sprue, flashing, and mold lines. Mold lines, just like the last thing. You'll find mold lines on almost everything, everything these days. But for here, what I really wanted to show you was the flashing. So see these little bits of just raw metal that are hanging off the ends of her hair? The texture of her hair ends here, and you see this medallion and string of metal, another one right here. Those little strings of metal are called flashing. So with these, you can either, if they're really little, I often will just use a hobby knife. So we'll take that, and we'll just get that right off of there. And if they're bigger, I'll use my side cutters. So you want to put see you've got an angled side and a flat side. Put the flat side up against the model, up against the area you want to cut it. Make sure you're not clipping off too much of the model. And there you go, comes right off. Fantastic. You can also, side cutters are also good. Sometimes there's a big chunk of metal coming up off the bottom of the base. You can side cut that away. And then use your knife to clean it up more if you need to. You're also going to use those side cutters here to take these pieces off of the sprue. You can either, always prime your metal models, by the way, but you can either paint them on the sprue and then cut them off and just touch up the little area that you cut off, or you can remove them all and maybe attach them to the model or just paint them free. That's up to you. I actually like to paint on the sprue sometimes because it just gives me something to hold onto, and I really don't mind if I have to touch up the butt of the pommel end of this sword before I glue it onto the model, right? You can also see even more flashing. See this big piece of metal right in here? Yeah, so that's definitely something you're going to use your side cutters take away. So metal does need to be primed, absolutely. You can use black, white, gray, or zenith. We'll be doing a video on the different types of priming and kind of the effects that they can give you as you work with them later on. So with metal, you're also going to get mold lines, and you're going to want to remove those with files, almost always. I will sometimes do some knife work if it's really evident, like if there's a mold line right up on a surface I can easily touch with my knife. But these ones in between the cape folds, see this? Yeah, there it is. So again, if you're not real fussy, you could just leave that and just paint over it. Chances are nobody would notice it, especially if your friends aren't painters. If you want to enter like a local painting competition at your local game store, though, do try to do your prep work. These can be tricky because they do have a lot of detail, so just try to remember that diamond files are really good at taking off mold lines with minimal pressure, but they're just as good at taking off detail. So go gently and slowly until you have your mold line removed. Now, there's something worth mentioning also is that this prep can be really relaxing. I worked at Games Workshop headquarters when it was out in Glen Burnie, Maryland, and just for a little while. But I knew a guy there who, at the time, a lot of the Games Workshop models were still metal, especially the characters. And he would go into the metal room, and when he needed a break from his work and he just wanted to like relax and think about his next steps, and he would sit there cleaning the models in the metal room, just random stuff that some gamer is going to be packaged. It was going to go out to some gamer who ordered it eventually. So some people, thanks to this guy, got cleaned models when they ordered their Space Marine captain or whatever he was working on at the time. It was pretty funny. But what he had right is that it is pretty therapeutic to just go around and gently clean and prep your models. So if you treat it as a Zen exercise, it can be very, very fun in that way. The other thing that prep does is it gives you time to really look over the model, to see the details on it, and to plan your color scheme, right? So as you're looking over the model, you might notice that it's got trim on its armor, and you'd be like, oh, these buttons down the front. You're like, oh, maybe I should make those gold or silver. What color am I going to make the leather armor, right? So all of these things give you time to kind of think about the model, kind of to bond with the model in a way. Often when I'm doing prep work, I'm kind of bonding with the character and thinking about what kind of character it is, and then from there I'll kind of figure out a color scheme. So, all right, let's move on though. That is metal. And of course you want to use super glue to glue your metal models together. You can use... There's all sorts of brands. Loctite is good, Zap-A-Gap is good. Any super glue, but I wouldn't use the very thin ones. The very thin ones are for pieces with a perfect fit, and on most metal miniatures, you are not going to get that. All right, let's move on to Cyocast and Resin. So Cyocast is a relatively new technology that's been used for model kits for a long time, but Reaper also uses it for their newest line, Bones USA. So I'm going to kind of cover that and Resin at the same time. So this is a Bones USA model. It's got very, very good detail. You can see, this is, again, you can see the Bones USA material. It's gray. It looks a lot like Resin. And this, I treat these the same because the type of plastic that the Cyocast is, it acts almost exactly like resin. So, and this is poured resin. It's not 3D printed resin. We're going to talk about 3D prints in just a couple minutes. So with resin, most of what you're dealing with is going to be mold lines. You can see this is a Mark Maskelyns figure. It's actually a girl at a concert. She's so cool. And one thing about resin busts, and this is a bust, as you can see, it's a bigger model. But one thing about resin is that it does tend to be really, really clean. I don't usually get a whole lot of mold lines and issues with the resin models that I order. There's usually at least one, though, and this is one. So just like with the other stuff, I'll take, if it's really open, I'll take my knife and I'll just try to lightly scrape that resin away. If you're going to be doing files, you do want to wear a respirator mask for this. because resin dust is bad and you really, really don't want to breathe it in. So I'm not going to show you files. You pretty much file them the same way as you would a metal figure. But yeah, so I'll use my knife to get some of these big parts worn down, and then I'll go in with my files to clean up. Unfortunately, there is a texture on this coat, so you are going to lose the texture when you're taking that mold line off, and there's not really much to be done about that because the texture is super, super fine. It's like a denim texture that's actually sculpted onto the model. There's not much you can do about that except to just try to paint it the same way you paint the stuff around it and kind of disguise that. And another thing you're going to find is vents. This is just like these big things on the metal figures that are leading up. It's essentially where the material is flowing through in order to fill out the mold. So you'll find this this kind of thing on resin pieces. It's usually on the bottom, but here I've got one on the side. So this I definitely would be either slicing away at with my knife. If it's big enough and I can get the tip of my clippers in there, I can try to take some of it off with clippers, but this is too flush to do that. So pretty much it's the slow, steady cutting away with the knife until I'll get the arm and essentially test fit it. Once the arm is in here, you really can't see this anyway, so as long as it's flush enough, you don't have to get it perfect. And again, a clever mold maker is going to do that. They're going to place vents and unsightly stuff. There's another one up there. They're going to place vents and unsightly stuff like this in a place that's going to be covered up once you add the piece that's supposed to be here. And that saves you time, and they don't have to worry about it showing up on a part of the model that is very visible and you having to deal with it. So it's good for them, good for you. All right, styrene. Styrene is used pretty much exclusively by Games Workshop. Some other companies, gaming companies, may be going into it. Styrene is this sprue-based plastic. And it's very hard. It's somewhat easy to snap the very thin parts of it off. It normally comes like this, and I don't find these days Games Workshop is very clever with the way that they mold their plastics. You don't often find a mold line, but when you do, you can see it right there on the side of the paw, right? So for this, for styrene, Games Workshop actually created a sprue mold line removal tool. And the way this works is you just kind of scrape it just like a hobby knife. Scrape it over the surface. And it's not very good at taking off these big chunky parts, but for the finer mold lines, which is most of what you're going to find, it's actually very good. It's very pleasant to use. The curved shape is nice. However, if you are cheap, or you just don't want to throw that money, because they will charge you very, very much for that simple tool, guess what? You can use the back of your hobby knife. So I can essentially do the same scraping with this that I could with the other thing, and I'm still taking that mold line right off. Plus, for this little thing, I am definitely going to take it off with my knife, with the actual edge of my knife. I'll essentially take as much of it off as I can. Then I'm going to use the back of the knife to get rid of that mold line. Ta-da! Very easy. So, although this can be tedious if you find mold lines on a lot of different pieces in the model, it's actually quite easy and fast, as you can see, to clean these up. Do make sure that you're not taking off intentional texture. Some of this looks like it might actually be intentionally trying to mimic the wave of the fur, kind of like I can see bits coming out of the tail here. So take a close look before you remove it, but in the end, if it looks bad to you, you don't have to feel guilty about removing it, even if they thought that it was a clever way to hide their mold lines. So yeah. Last but not least is everybody's favorite, most popular thing to do these days, print 3D models. This is an adorable pugling that I have from Jason Wiebe, our sculptor for Reaper. He and a couple of the other guys have started their own game, and they have models for it. And Jason decided to do some oversized pieces of his game models, and this is one of his puglings. So she is a 3D print, and she has, because she was very quickly printed for the show and not cleaned, she's not cleaned too much. She is a great example for us to talk about cleaning up 3D prints. There's a lot of material online for this, but when you're dealing with 3D prints, you're usually dealing with supports that have not been taken off, like that little piece right there, or this big piece under the ear like this. And honestly, I find the easiest way to take these off is just with the tip of my hobby knife. Just follow it down, break it off, and And then use the hobby knife to kind of cut away that little bit. There we go. They're usually pretty brittle and they don't really want to stick. So it's relatively simple to remove these guys. Sometimes you'll find one that broke off at the wrong point here. Again, I almost always will use a hobby knife for this. If you use files on 3D print resin, do use a respirator, just like with regular resin. But when I'm just taking these guys off with a knife, with big chunks, I'm not going to breathe those chunks in, so I feel pretty safe there. No doubt somebody's going to come on the comments and yell at me about this, but that's fine. Bottom line, depending on your safety threshold, if you really feel uncomfortable working with resin because of toxicity, potential issues, do just wear a respirator. One thing that you can see that can be difficult is that you can end up with some of those little nubbins coming out here where there's a textured surface. And that can be difficult. You just got to be real patient. Sometimes you can use the side cutters to remove some of this, but most side cutters aren't going to be fine enough to really take it off as neatly as you need it to. So I do depend a lot on my hobby knife for this sort of thing. When you take off these supports, though, what you might notice is an unfortunate propensity to pit. So when that little support breaks off, maybe it leaves a little hollow hole there, like the ear. There are a couple more pits up here. And this is the sort of thing that I would use putty to fill. So after I had everything removed and made sure that I'd note essentially the position of any of these holes. If it's a big model, I might make a list to make sure I don't miss any of them, because it's so easy to forget one of these little things when they're hanging around. But I would use a putty. You could use anything from, usually these are all epoxy putties, so there are 2-part epoxy that you mix. You could use Milliput's Superfine White, or you could use Abe's Epoxy Sculpt, which is APOXIE Sculpt. And those are putties where if you mix them up and apply them, you can actually apply water over the top and smooth them in. It will actually dissolve the putty a bit, so they're really good for pit filling. You could also use a really thick gloss varnish if you'd like. I know a lot of people who do that to also tackle any remaining print lines. So you can essentially put the coat of gloss varnish over the top, maybe even a few coats if it's a lot of print lines showing through. And then after you prime, you won't be able to see anything. So you may have to reapply the gloss varnish a little bit in a couple of coats to fill in those pits, but it is a possibility if the pits are really shallow that you can do that. I did want to mention one last thing about models. As many of you who have 3D printers know, 3D print resin gets an alcohol bath to remove essentially any extra resin that hasn't cured on the surface after the print. Another thing that benefits from alcohol baths is resin models. So it's not necessary. It really depends. I was not one to do it very often, but I do know people who swear by it. So using a 90% isopropyl and just giving your resins a brief wash with that can help remove any mold release. I would be very cautious about using it on other materials, except you could do it for metal, but metal I find washing the model with soap and water to be a little more effective. So depending on the material you're using, different sorts of wash can also help your paint and or primer stick to the model. All right, that is all I want to tackle today, I think. Hopefully that answers a lot of your questions about prepping. I will put on my list to do a little demo of using green stuff, epoxy putty, with models to cover up a mold line instead of having to excavate it. Sometimes there's mold lines that you just can't get a tool to, or that you'll take off detail pretty substantially if you try. And that's when I tend to turn to sculpting, just a tiny bit of sculpting, really easy sculpting, to fill in a mold line instead of trying to excavate it or take it off. So we'll do something on that. We'll have priming heading up, and I'm probably going to do pinning next. So pinning is another thing that can help to strengthen your models against breakage. All right? Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Remember, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/paintingbig, where I go into detail on a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be covering for these short YouTube videos. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I love all the views I'm getting in my YouTube recently, and it's really inspired me to do a lot more videos for you. So keep your eyes out for that, and I'll be getting back to you very soon. All right? Thanks very much, and this is Anne signing off.